Hello friends, welcome back to Cosmopolitan Cornbread. So if you hear some rumbling sort of noise in the background, it is 104 degrees outside and we have got every fan on in the house. It is hot. And so a lot of times when I'm filming videos, I'll actually turn everything off in there to make it quieter, but at 104 degrees, and that is actual temperature, not the heat index, we're not turning anything off today. So today for the home ec lesson, we are going to learn about leavening, what it is, what it does, and different types of leavening that you might encounter in recipes in your kitchen. And then next week we will begin doing recipes using each of these types of leavening. So what is leavening? So first, let's briefly talk about what it is and how it works in your recipes. Very simply, leavening is the ingredient in your recipes, in your foods, usually baked goods, but not always, that causes those foods to kind of fluff up. It makes the bread rise, the cookies puff up, and it makes angel food cake the spongy, fluffy cake that it is. The most common kinds of leavening are yeast, baking powder, baking soda, and eggs. These ingredients are also called leavening agents. First, we'll talk about yeast. Yeast is a very small, single-celled fungus, and there are several kinds of store-bought yeast to choose from. First, there is fresh yeast, and that comes as refrigerated blocks, which can be condensed or as cakes. There's dry yeast, which comes as active dry yeast, rapid rise yeast, or instant yeast. Active dry yeast must be dissolved in water before you use it, and it takes a little bit longer for your breads and other things to rise. Rapid rise or instant yeast can be mixed directly into the rest of your ingredients, and they often rise faster, sometimes even twice as fast as active dry yeast. When you're using yeast, you're basically waking up inactive fungus and creating an environment for that yeast to live and grow in. It requires liquid, warmth, and food. When working with yeast, it's important to make sure that the environment is warm, but not hot and not cold. When you wake up the yeast with the warmth and water and food, it begins to grow. As it grows, it produces gases, and those gases are the air inside your baked good. Yeast is most commonly used in things like dinner rolls or sandwich bread. Now, some people find yeast to be very intimidating. I think that is simply because it takes a little bit more work to use, and people envision all sorts of problems. Sometimes it does take a little bit of time to master using yeast, and even a seasoned baker can have something flop. It happens to the best. But once you get the hang of it, the possibilities are endless, and there is nothing like homemade bread just out of the oven. On my website, Cosmopolitan Cornbread, I have an article that is a troubleshooting guide for yeast breads. It has a list of all the most common problems that people have, what may be the cause of that problem, as well as how to fix it. I will put a link to that article in the video description below. When storing yeast, it should be stored in a cold, dry, dark environment. Once a container of yeast is opened, it generally does not last very long, sometimes as little as 2 weeks. The kind of yeast that I use most often is an instant yeast, and it comes in a vacuum sealed package. But it comes as a 1-pound bag, and I cannot use that much yeast that quickly. So what I do is I open the package, I pour a portion of the yeast into a glass jar, and I store it in my refrigerator, and then the package of yeast, I use my vacuum seal tool and I vacuum seal it once again, and I'll store that bag in the refrigerator as well, and then simply open it up and refill my jar as I use up the yeast. This tends to keep both portions of yeast fresher longer and reduces the chances of it going to waste. In the Bible, there's often references to leavening. In those days, leavening was wild-caught yeast, yeast that lives everywhere. It's in the air, it's on surfaces, it's even on the peel of an apple. We most often know of this wild yeast as sourdough. Sourdough starter, which is what you need to make any sourdough recipe, is simply flour and water that has been mixed together and allowed to ferment, which encourages that natural wild yeast to grow. That mixture becomes the sourdough starter for recipes, and that starter is fed every day with more water and flour to keep that natural yeast alive and thriving. Then that starter is used to make things like sourdough bread or sourdough pancakes. In biblical times, they didn't have grocery stores where they could go and buy rapid rise yeast, so they had to catch the wild yeast in the air themselves. Because of that, bread took a good bit of time to make. When the Israelites fled slavery in Egypt, they were told to eat their Passover meal the night before they left, with their shoes on, and to eat bread that had no leavening. It was called matzah. Matzah is a flat bread, a lot like a cracker, that is made very quickly with no leavening. They had to be ready to leave at any moment when the Pharaoh told them to go. And since then, the Feast of Unleavened Bread is celebrated every year in remembrance of that event. The next leavening ingredient or leavening agent is baking soda. Baking soda is sodium bicarbonate. Baking soda works by reacting to the liquid and the acid in foods to create carbon dioxide. It reacts immediately with these ingredients and must be baked immediately after it's mixed in. If you let the food sit a while before baking, the chemical reaction will have ended and those bubbles may completely deflate, giving you very flat bread. This is why preheating your oven when you're baking is very important. You want your oven to be at the right temperature so that whatever you are mixing up with baking soda is ready to go straight into the oven as soon as it's ready. Next, we'll talk about baking powder. Baking powder is a combination of baking soda, acids, and cornstarch. The cornstarch keeps the acids from reacting to the baking soda in your baking powder container. Most baking powder is called double acting. This means that the baking soda in it reacts to the liquid ingredients as soon as it is mixed in, creating air bubbles, and then it reacts again when it is cooked or baked. So it acts twice. There are many brands of baking powder out there. Some of them, however, do contain aluminum. Personally, I don't like to use aluminum, so I'm always diligent about reading the ingredients on the can. There are also ways to make your own baking powder. I have an article on my website with 2 different recipes, and I'll put a link to that in the video description as well. Baking soda and baking powder are often used in things like quick breads, such as zucchini bread or pumpkin bread, waffles, muffins, or cookies. And the fourth leavening agent we're going to talk about is eggs. Now, it may surprise you that eggs can also be a leavening agent, but eggs can be helpful as leavening in 2 different ways. First, eggs can contribute as being part of the liquid in the recipe that will help create steam in your food as it cooks or bakes. That's why scrambled eggs puff up in the skillet when you're cooking them. Secondly, whipped egg whites create thousands of little cells of air that are again filled with steam in the baking process. As the food item bakes, the steam expands inside those cells. Whipped egg whites can produce a volume that is up to 8 times their original size when they're whipped. When whipping eggs, the protein in the egg whites seal in the air bubbles that you create when you're whipping them. Adding an acid like cream of tartar or lemon juice can help stabilize those egg white air bubbles or cells, making the foam hold its shape and size a little bit longer. A great example of something like that would be meringue cookies, which are nothing more than flavored beaten egg whites that are sweetened and baked. In many baked goods, the protein in the eggs work with the proteins in the flour, called gluten, and the starches, which allows the structure of those cells to retain their shape even after your baked good has cooled. And the best example of this that I can think of is angel food cake. Angel food cake has no leavening other than beaten egg whites. Yet it is one of the fluffiest cakes there is. So that is a brief introduction to the different types of leavening and how they might be used. Next week, we will get started on putting that information to practice. So that is it for today. Thanks for joining me here again at Cosmopolitan Cornbread. My name is Constance, and I'll talk to y'all next time.